successful leadership transition and what that means for successful fundraising. Hi, I'm Bill Stanczykiewicz. This is the first day from the Fundraising School, and I'm joined today by Bill Peterson, principal at CarterBaldwin, an international search firm that is finding leaders in the philanthropic sector, in higher education, and for the nonprofit sector overall. Bill, what a delight to have you with us on the Fundraising Schools podcast.
Thank you, Bill. It's great to be with you. And we certainly sit up more when we see the Lilly School of Philanthropy on a resume. So it's an honor to be with you today.
Well, really appreciate that shout out. And I want to ask you, you are doing searches, you and your colleagues in the United States and around the world. Kind of let's just start at a big macro level here. How would you describe just how important is this to have a successful leadership transition?
Well, it's incredibly successful. The mission of the organizations that we serve are important, and they're making a difference in and around the world and the lives of people. And to minimize disruption is incredibly important, and to continue to enhance the work and advance the work that's being done really begins with a successful handoff. And so we find it to be incredibly important that there's a lot of thought on the part of the board, outgoing president, and the incoming president to ensure a successful transition.
Our interview today is based on a new case study published by CarterBaldwin and the experience they had with Compassion International, an international nonprofit that is providing poverty alleviation, child development, community development across the globe. Before we get to some of those findings, Bill, maybe kind of the opposite look. Throughout your career, what are some of the common mistakes that you see, those head scratchers where you're like, oh, guys, we want to find you your next leader, but we're seeing this again? Or what kind of stands out that you've seen, sadly, consistently during these times of leadership transition?
Maybe two sides of the same coin. One is a board that may be too passive in their involvement in the transition. That sometimes happens because a longtime successful CEO may have had the helm and been driving steering the ship for so many years. There's a high level of trust and confidence, and over time that board begins to pull back some. And so it's a new muscle when that leader is going to depart for a board to step in. And not all do that well, and not all do that early or often enough. And some are even quick to try and or continue to delegate that work to the outgoing CEO. My colleague Price Harding wrote an article a year or so ago about the most important role of a CEO. Job of a CEO is to know whether or not the right CEO is leading the organization. And so it is also important that the CEO have a safe space to be able to talk about transition and succession, to begin to communicate with their board when they feel like they may not be the right person for the future. And frankly, to begin to put things in place where the board could lead more and the CEO can use its influence to promote the new CEO in a successful transition without having their thumb and or over leaning into the process and or trying to dictate a process. This is really a board-led process with advice and counsel from us as a consultant, from the outgoing CEO, and frankly, from the incoming CEO.
Bill, if I can ask you, do you have any coaching for that longtime CEO? Because with empathy, we can say, that longtime CEO isn't doing anything, maybe improper, but human nature can be it's just difficult to let go, right? And maybe it is time for my retirement. It is time for me to move on. And many people have written about this for many, many years, that it can be difficult for that CEO to say, yes, my time has come to pass that baton. What coaching might you have for those veteran CEOs who find themselves in that position?
I think recognizing it is the beginning of a successful transition. I think you're right. CEOs lead, and they're used to being the leader, and they're used to taking the first step. They're used to delegating and able to enable the work to be done and to be done well, but they're not delegating control. And this becomes the beginning of the delegation of control, which can be unsettling for people who have led their entire lives in some cases. And so one is the awareness of that and beginning to cede control to the board and to stakeholders that have proper governance in such a transition. The other that you'll see in the case study, and another one that we're going to be producing here very shortly, is the humility of the leader is essential in this transition. If their identity is still and continues to be wrapped up in the mission and in the organization and their ownership of the leadership of an organization, they tend to be the CEOs that don't behave well in the midst of a transition. And the most humble, the most wise, some of the people that you would think would naturally gravitate to handing over such a process, as you get closer to the end, they begin to exert that muscle that they know, which is leadership. And that's the time where humility is required the most. And I think that's what you saw and we'll see in the case study with Wes Stafford and Jimmy Miato.
Well, that is wonderful advice and great coaching, Bill. Appreciate that. And as we say, moving on now to looking at the actual transition process and finding that next leader, you've mentioned a couple of times that the board needs to take a primary role. You also mentioned in this case study on Compassion International involving other key stakeholders. Who are some of those other key stakeholders who need to be involved?
Well, I think one of the best practices was the intentionality around communication with donors. That comes from the outgoing CEO, the folks that are responsible for development and advancement within an organization. The board takes an active role in that. There needs to be a plan for stakeholders and for stakeholder engagement. And that plan should happen soon after a decision has been made by the board and by the CEO to institute a transition or execute a transition. And so it can be really important to be thoughtful about who and how donors in particular need to be communicated with. Other trustees or boards of advisors, other stakeholders that are your partners in the work, an intentionality around the plan and the communication really happens at the board level. The CEO, the outgoing CEO, and the executive team need to be leaning into stakeholder engagement to make sure that all are aware, they're invited into the conversation, and frankly, there's an opportunity to dream about what the future could be together, and it creates a collaboration that wouldn't otherwise exist.
The steps have been taken. The CEO has recognized the time to pass the baton. The board has been fully engaged, as have other key stakeholders. The search has happened and the new leader has been hired. What does the transition look like in terms of specific expectations? Is there a public ceremony? What is the role in an emeritus situation for the previous CEO? What does this transition look like, Bill?
Yeah, it can look like a lot of different things. I think one of the things I appreciated about the compassion case study was Wes's intentionality around becoming less so that Jimmy Miato could become more in the midst of that transition. And he did little things like intentionally reached out to Jimmy's wife and asked, what does Jimmy like? And how is his office set up now? And when Jimmy had not yet become the CEO, but was transitioning in, Wes had moved out of the corner office, if you will. I don't know if it was on a corner, but he moved out of the CEO office and he had his office reconfigured to fit what Jimmy would prefer and would look like when Jimmy walked in, with Jimmy's name on the door. And it was a communication to everyone that there was a new CEO coming in. There's a level of humility in that Wes moved to an insular office, available but not next to, down the hall, if you will, so that if Jimmy needed him, he was accessible. But those kind of little steps or activities really do begin, I think, to set the stage. There were a couple other things that were involved. I think there was a public ceremony where Wes endorsed Jimmy and humorously said, the role of the CEO just became younger and more handsome with Jimmy's entrance into the role. And it allowed people to breathe, that the outgoing CEO endorsed the transition, endorsed the new leader, led his credibility to the next CEO in a way that enabled the rest of the organization to follow suit. Jimmy, likewise, instituted incredible humility and honoring the legacy of Wes Stafford. And when I see presidents, years ago, I recognized that really great leaders never say anything negative about their prior president or CEO. They're always celebrating the legacy that followed before them while charting a course forward that it may be different and oftentimes a very different direction. But that endorsing of the legacy provides, I think, a better framework for a transition and celebration of that. Of course, the board is still involved and very much orchestrating in the background and making sure and holding accountable that the key things are taking place that support that transition. And one other thing that came out of the conversation that was completely surprising to me, but I think is the best practice, in that in Compassion's case, they had a long-standing board member who had a close relationship with Wes Stafford, who became an advisor and a go-between, a liaison between the outgoing CEO and the board of trustees. And that person was both a coach for Wes and a coach for the board, and was able to provide some insight to the incoming CEO as well. And having somebody in that seat to make sure that any wrinkles that might emerge are being ironed out, that the outgoing CEO is being honored well, and that he's being heard or she's being heard on their transition out. I think that advisor role, whether you hire from the outside, in the case of a case study that'll be coming up soon that Our Daily Bread did, or you tap a trusted advisor within the organization to be that coach and counselor, I think that was a tremendous learning.
A lot of great advice there that the rest of us can follow in this case study on Compassion International, published by CarterBaldwin. Bill, kind of a last category of questions here. There are 14 findings of, here are some 14 steps that people can follow and implement. And one of those 14 does involve donors. And you mentioned donors earlier in this conversation. I'd like to ask you, please, to expand on that. When are we communicating to donors at the start, in the middle, afterwards, and how does doing this well positively affect fundraising? And conversely, how could we harm fundraising if we don't do this well?
Yeah, I just spoke with a CEO last week who transitioned to a new CEO position. So left his prior organization, started in a new one. And he shared with me that there were 2 conversations that needed to be had with significant donors who had given significantly to support the work and the mission and the vision that he had projected. And yet he was leaving after that investment had been made in the organization. And he was dreading that conversation, but that was an important one for him to go and have with each of those donors in person. And when he laid out the intentionality or the broader role that influence that this person would be able to have in their sphere, it became a moment between the donor and the outgoing president of, frankly, celebration, that it was obvious that you were being called, if you will, to serve in this new capacity. And how could you do anything but do that? And it enabled the outgoing president to steer the conversation and to introduce the opportunity to partner with the new president. The new president isn't always going to continue on with the same initiatives as the outgoing president, but it was a perfect way to have that handoff in what looked like a very difficult conversation on the front end became a celebration and part of a transition at the end. And in the same way, as you're leaving, you're having those important conversations. As you're coming in, there needs to be somebody, whether it's the vice president of advancement or chief development officer, a chairman of the board, and or all the stakeholders that we've been talking about need to speak into who do we need to spend time with, who do we need to invest in to make sure that they are being honored and communicated in the midst of this transition. And I think that communication, the intentionality of it, I think really helps bring donors along in what could be a problematic issue if in some ways you've surprised them in ways that was really unnecessary.
Bill, we talked earlier about stakeholders to involve. It sure sounds like that chief development officer needs to be involved throughout the process so that she or he can inform the rest of the fundraisers how to talk about this transition to donors.
Absolutely. I think it's incredibly important, and that person ought to have a voice, if not on a search committee or not necessarily on the board, but have access to the search committee chair, the board chair, and the other stakeholders that are involved, so that these things aren't falling through the cracks.
Research shows that donors love stability. And in fact, a long tenured CEO can be a positive asset, especially in major gift fundraising. If we have a new leader, then the leader's vision is influential to continue major gift fundraising. But either way, donors love stability, and stability occurs when we have a successful leadership transition. The study is called Passing the Baton at Compassion International, a model for CEO transition. The folks at CarterBaldwin make this available for free at CarterBaldwin.com. Their principal is Bill Peterson. Bill, thanks so much for being with us on the Fundraising Schools podcast.
Thank you, Bill. It's a great conversation. Enjoyed it.
And we talk about leadership in the courses leading up to our certificate in fundraising leadership, one of 5 certificates that we offer through our 25 public courses at the Fundraising School. We also can customize our training, taking a little bit of this course and a little bit of that course and knitting this together, tailored to your specific needs. Our training is in person or online in the United States and anywhere across the world. We have quarterly webinars and this weekly podcast, and all of our knowledge gathered in our textbook, Achieving Excellence in Fundraising, the book now out in its 5th edition. This information is available online at go.iu.edu/TFRS for the Fundraising School. Grateful to our producers today, the Emmy Award winner Mike Anthony and my colleague Jennifer Boffman, CFRM. I'm Bill Stanczykiewicz, and now you are now more fully informed on this first day from the Fundraising School.